At a school play, my daughter slipped me a note that said, "He's here again." The gymnasium had been transformed into something magical. Purple curtains hung from makeshift rafters, and paper flowers decorated every corner. The smell of popcorn mixed with nervous excitement as parents filled the metal folding chairs' phones ready to capture their children's big moments. I should have been thrilled. My daughter Ayana had landed the role of the woodland fairy queen in Enchanted Forest, and she'd been practicing her lines every night for 3 weeks, spinning around our living room in her sparkly green costume. But sitting here in the third row, clutching my purse like a lifeline, I couldn't shake the knot that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. It had been there for 8 months now, ever since that night when Marcus showed up at our door with wild eyes and clenched fists, demanding to see his family. The sound of our front window shattering still woke me up sometimes, glass fragments glittering in the streetlight like deadly stars. "You can't keep her from me forever, Sarah," he'd screamed as the police dragged him away. "She's got Harrison blood in her veins. She belongs with us." The restraining order was supposed to change everything. Marcus Harrison, my ex-boyfriend's younger brother, was supposed to stay at least 500 feet away from me and Ayana. The court papers were very clear about that. But restraining orders are just pieces of paper, and Marcus had always been good at finding ways around inconvenient rules. I adjusted my position in the uncomfortable chair and tried to focus on the stage. The 7th graders were doing their best with the opening scene, a group of forest animals discussing the mysterious disappearance of spring. Little Tommy Martinez, dressed as a rabbit, forgot his lines halfway through and stood frozen until the girl playing a squirrel whispered loudly enough for the entire audience to hear. Parents around me chuckled and "ed" at the mistake. Mrs. Patterson, sitting to my left, leaned over and whispered, "Aren't they precious? My grandson is the oak tree in Act 2. I nodded and smiled, but my eyes kept scanning the crowd. Old habit. I'd gotten good at cataloging exits, counting security personnel, and noting anyone who seemed out of place. The auditorium lights dimmed as the scene changed, and I felt my shoulders relax slightly. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe I could just be a normal mom, watching her daughter shine on stage, without constantly looking over my shoulder for threats that might not even materialize. That's when I saw the small hand reaching through the gap in the stage curtains. At first, I thought it was part of the performance, but the hand was gesturing specifically toward me, and I recognized the silver bracelet I'd given Ayana for her birthday. My heart picked up its pace as I realized she was trying to get my attention without breaking character or alerting the other performers. The folded piece of paper was small, no bigger than a post-it note. She managed to slip it to me just as her cue approached, her fairy queen entrance that we'd practiced 100 times in our hallway. I unfolded it carefully, trying not to crinkle the paper in the silence between musical numbers. The words were written in Ayana's careful cursive, the kind she used for important school assignments. "He's here again." Time stopped. The blood in my veins turned to ice water, and suddenly the warm gymnasium felt like the inside of a freezer. My hands started shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the note. Around me, the audience continued watching the play, completely unaware that my world had just tilted off its axis. He's here again. Marcus had found us. Despite the restraining order, despite changing our phone number and asking the school to put extra security measures in place, despite all my careful planning and paranoid checking, he was here, in this room, watching my daughter perform. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe Ayana was mistaken. Maybe she'd seen someone who looked like Marcus from a distance. She'd only met him a handful of times before that terrible night, and it had been dark in the auditorium. Children's imaginations could run wild, especially when they'd heard whispered phone conversations about restraining orders and police reports. But even as I tried to convince myself it was a false alarm, I knew better. Ayana was 12 years old, smart as a whip, and had inherited her father's observational skills along with his dark eyes. If she said Marcus was here, then Marcus was here. On stage, my daughter glided across the wooden floor in her fairy costume, her voice clear and confident as she delivered her opening monologue about the magic that lived in growing things. She looked radiant under the stage lights, her smile bright enough to power the entire school. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept flicking toward the back of the auditorium even as she hit every mark and remembered every line. She was scared, and she was trying to be brave for me. The realization made my chest tighten with a mixture of pride and terror. How had we gotten here? How had my beautiful, talented daughter learned to be afraid at a middle school play? What kind of mother was I if I couldn't even keep her safe at her own performance? I stuffed the note into my jacket pocket and tried to focus on Ayana's scene, but my mind was already racing through possibilities. Should I call the police now? Should I try to find Marcus myself? Should I get Ayana off the stage and out of the building as quickly as possible? The applause for the Fairy Queen's entrance was enthusiastic, and I clapped along automatically, my hands moving without any input from my brain. Parents around me were beaming with pride, their biggest worry probably whether they were getting good video footage. I envied them their innocence, their ability to simply enjoy their children's achievements without constantly calculating threat levels and escape routes. But that luxury had been taken from us 8 months ago, when Marcus Harrison decided that his brother's abandonment of our family didn't mean he had to let us go. Now he was here, somewhere in this crowd of proud parents and excited siblings, watching my daughter with those intense eyes that had always made me uncomfortable. Even before the violence, even when he was just Harrison's weird younger brother who showed up uninvited to family gatherings, there had been something off about the way Marcus looked at Ayana. Something possessive and inappropriate that made my skin crawl. As the first act continued, I made my decision. I would wait until intermission, then find a way to get both of us out of here quietly. We could celebrate Ayana's performance later, when we were safe at home with the doors locked and the security system armed. The play would have to continue without its fairy queen. I just hope we could make it that long. My eyes began their systematic sweep of the auditorium, starting with the front rows and working backward. Mrs. Chun from the PDA sat in the second row, video recording her son's debut as a talking mushroom. Mr. Rodriguez bounced his toddler on his lap, while his older daughter performed a dance number with the other woodland creatures. Everything looked normal, families enjoying their children's moment in the spotlight. But normal was an illusion I could no longer afford to believe in. I continued scanning, my gaze moving methodically across each row like a security camera. The middle section held the usual mix of parents, grandparents, and younger siblings. Some people were checking their phones, others whispering quietly during the dialogue. A few had dozed off in the warm gymnasium, lulled by the gentle music and their long workdays. Then my eyes reached the back corner of the auditorium, where the overhead lights didn't quite reach and shadows pooled like dark water. He was there. Marcus Harrison stood against the far wall, half hidden behind a support beam, his body angled so he could watch the stage while remaining mostly concealed from the main seating area. Even in the dim lighting, I recognized the sharp angles of his face, the way he held his shoulders slightly hunched forward like he was ready to pounce. His hair was shorter now, buzzed close to his scalp in a military style that made his ears stick out, but there was no mistaking those pale eyes that seemed to see everything and forgive nothing. My breath caught in my throat as I realized he wasn't looking at me at all. His entire attention was focused on the stage, on my daughter, with an intensity that made my skin crawl. That same possessive stare I remembered from family gatherings, when he would watch Ayana play with an expression that was far too interested, far too invested in a child who wasn't his to care about. He was smiling. It was a small, satisfied smile, the kind someone might wear while watching a movie they'd seen before and enjoyed. Like he was pleased with how events were unfolding, like everything was going exactly according to his plan. The expression was so familiar it transported me instantly back to that horrible night 8 months ago, when he'd stood on my front porch wearing that exact same smile while explaining why Ayana needed to come live with her real family. "She's got Harrison blood," he'd said then, his voice calm and reasonable even as his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Her daddy might have run off, but that doesn't change what she is. Family takes care of family, Sarah. You can't do this alone." Looking at him now, I could see that nothing had changed in his mind. The restraining order, the court proceedings, the police reports, None of it had convinced him that Ayana wasn't his responsibility, his right, his to claim. If anything, the months of separation seemed to have intensified his fixation. On stage, Ayana was in the middle of her big solo number, her voice soaring over the piano accompaniment as she sang about the magic that connected all living things. Her performance was flawless, every note clear and true, but I could see the slight tremor in her hands and the way her eyes kept darting toward the back of the room. She knew exactly where he was standing, and she was singing for her life, trying to get through her part so she could get off stage and away from his predatory gaze. Marcus shifted his position slightly, and I saw him take a small step closer to the seating area. Not enough to draw attention from other audience members, but enough to get a better view of the stage. The movement was subtle, calculated, like everything else about him. He'd probably been planning this for weeks, maybe months, figuring out the school's schedule and waiting for the perfect opportunity to get close to Ayana in a crowded public place where I couldn't make a scene. My hands gripped the sides of my metal chair so tightly I could feel the cold seeping through my palms. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to grab Ayana, and get out of there immediately. But she was still performing, still on stage in front of hundreds of people, and I couldn't exactly rush up there and drag the fairy queen away without causing the kind of commotion that would traumatize her and confuse everyone else. Marcus seemed to understand this perfectly. He'd chosen his moment well, trapping us in a public performance where social expectations would keep me from acting on my panic. He could stand there and stare at my daughter to his heart's content, knowing I was powerless to stop him without disrupting her big night and making myself look like the crazy ex-girlfriend who couldn't let go of old grudges. But he'd made one crucial mistake. This time, I had proof that he was violating the restraining order. This time, I wasn't alone in a dark parking lot or an empty house. We were surrounded by witnesses, by other parents who knew us, by school officials who had been briefed on our situation. I slowly reached into my purse and found my phone, my fingers trembling slightly as I opened the camera app. If Marcus wanted to play games in public, then I would document every second of it. The restraining order violation would be crystal clear in the photos, time-stamped and geolocated, impossible for him to explain away in court. As I lifted my phone discreetly, Marcus's had turned slightly in my direction, as if he could sense my attention. Our eyes met across the crowded auditorium, and his smile widened just enough to show his teeth. He knew I'd seen him, and he didn't care. As Ayana's voice filled the auditorium with her fairy queen's lament, my mind spiraled backward through time like a film reel spinning in reverse. The gymnasium walls seemed to fade away, replaced by the memory of flashing red and blue lights painting my living room in alternating colors of chaos and authority. It had been a Tuesday night in December when everything finally came to a head. Ayana had been asleep for hours, exhausted from a day of final exams and holiday preparations at school. I was wrapping Christmas presents in the living room, trying to make her holiday special despite the fact that her father had disappeared before she was even born, leaving nothing behind but unpaid bills and a family that seemed to think his abandonment gave them ownership rights over his daughter. The knock on the door came at 10:47 p.m. I remembered the exact time because I'd been watching the clock, calculating how many hours of sleep I could get before my morning shift at the nursing home. When I looked through the peephole, Marcus was standing there in the glow of the porch light, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets and that familiar smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Sarah, we need to talk," he'd said when I cracked the door open with the chain still attached. "It's about Ayana's future." Even then, I'd known something was wrong. Marcus had never visited our house before, never shown any real interest in his brother's daughter beyond the occasional awkward interaction at family gatherings. But his voice was calm, reasonable, like he was discussing the weather or asking to borrow a cup of sugar. "It's late, Marcus. Whatever this is about can wait until tomorrow." "No," he'd said, and the smile never wavered. "It really can't." That's when I noticed his eyes. They had that glassy, unfocused look that I'd learned to recognize from my years working with psychiatric patients at the hospital. It was the look of someone whose grip on reality had become negotiable, someone who had convinced themselves that their delusions were not only true but justified. "She needs to be with family," He continued, pressing his face closer to the gap in the door. Real family. People who understand what she is, where she comes from. You're not enough, Sarah. You've never been enough. I'd tried to close the door then, but Marcus had been ready for that. His shoulder slammed against the wood with enough force to strain the security chain, and suddenly he was shouting, his calm facade cracking like ice under pressure. She's got Harrison blood. She belongs with us. You can't keep her locked away, like some kind of prisoner. The neighbor's lights had started coming on as his voice carried through the quiet suburban street. Mrs. Williams from across the way had peered through her curtains, probably wondering if she should call the police. I wished she had, because what happened next would haunt me for months. Marcus had pulled his fist back and punched straight through my front window. The sound was explosive in the winter air, glass fragments showering the porch and my entryway like deadly confetti. Blood immediately began streaming from his knuckles, but he didn't seem to notice or care. He was staring at me through the jagged hole where my window used to be, his eyes bright with something that might have been triumph or might have been madness. You see, he'd said, his voice dropping back to that eerily calm tone. I can get to her whenever I want. Locks don't matter. Distance doesn't matter. She's family, and family always finds a way. That's when Ayanna had appeared at the top of the stairs, her small face pale with terror, still wearing her penguin pajamas. She'd taken one look at the broken glass, at Marcus's bleeding hand reaching through the window frame, and started crying with the kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that only come from genuine fear. Mommy, she'd whispered, and hearing that tiny, scared voice had shattered something inside me that I didn't even know could break. The police arrived 14 minutes later, responding to multiple neighbor complaints about the disturbance. Marcus had been standing in my entryway by then, glass crunching under his boots, explaining to anyone who would listen that he was simply trying to protect his niece from an unfit mother who was keeping her from her rightful family. Officer Martinez, a kind woman with teenagers of her own, had listened to Marcus's rambling explanation with professional patience before calmly informing him that he was under arrest for destruction of property, criminal trespass, and intimidation. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked back at our house and called out, "This isn't over, Sarah. You can't fight blood. You can't fight family." The restraining order had been issued 3 days later, after a hearing where Marcus had represented himself and spent 20 minutes explaining to the judge why Ayanna needed to be rescued from my inadequate parenting. The court had been unimpressed with his arguments, particularly after hearing about the broken window and seeing the photos of his bloody handprints on my door frame. But even as the judge read the terms of the protective order, 500 feet minimum distance, no contact with either myself or Ayanna, immediate arrest if violated, I could see in Marcus's eyes that he considered it nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. He'd disappeared after that, seemingly vanishing from the face of the earth. His apartment was cleared out within a week, his job at the auto parts store abandoned without notice. For months, I'd lived in constant fear that he would reappear without warning, that I'd wake up to find him standing in our yard or following Ayanna home from school. Now, watching him lurk in the shadows of my daughter's school play, I realized he'd never really left at all. He'd just been waiting for the perfect moment to remind us that in his mind, court orders were just pieces of paper and family ties were forever. The first act ended with thunderous applause as the woodland creatures took their bows. Ayanna curtsied gracefully in her sparkling costume, but I could see the strain around her eyes, the way her smile didn't quite reach them. She caught my gaze from the stage, and I nodded once, a subtle signal we'd developed over the months of living in fear. It meant, stay calm. We have a plan. As the curtain fell and the house lights came up for intermission, I was already moving. I stood up casually, stretching like any other parent who'd been sitting too long in uncomfortable metal chairs. Around me, the audience began their typical intermission shuffle, parents heading to the concession stand, kids running to find their families, teachers directing traffic flow toward the bathrooms. "Excuse me," I murmured to Mrs. Patterson as I squeezed past her. "Just going to check on something backstage." The plan was simple. Get to Ayanna during the costume change, tell her there was a family emergency that required us to leave immediately, and slip out through the back exit near the gymnasium's loading dock. I'd already mapped the route during previous school events, always thinking ahead, always preparing for the day when our past would catch up with us. But as I made my way toward the stage area, weaving through clusters of chatting parents, I kept one eye on the back corner where Marcus had been standing. The shadows were empty now, and somehow that was worse than seeing him there. At least when I could see him, I knew where the threat was coming from. The backstage area was controlled chaos. 7th and 8th graders were everywhere, changing costumes, touching up makeup, and running through their lines for the second act. Mrs. Rodriguez, the drama teacher, was trying to keep order while dealing with a minor crisis involving a ripped squirrel tail. I found Ayana in the makeshift dressing area behind the piano, carefully hanging up her fairy queen costume and reaching for the simpler dress she would wear in the final scene. Her hands were shaking slightly as she worked the buttons. "Hey, baby," I said softly, kneeling down to her level. "We need to go." She looked up at me with those dark eyes that were so much like her father's, and I saw my own fear reflected back at me. "Is he still out there?" "I don't know, but we're not taking any chances. Tell Mrs. Rodriguez you're feeling sick, and we'll slip out the back way. The understudies know all the parts." Ayana nodded quickly, already reaching for her regular clothes. She'd gotten good at emergency exits over the past 8 months, and I hated that my 12-year-old daughter had needed to develop that particular skill set. We were almost ready to go when Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with her clipboard and frazzled expression. "Ayana, honey, you need to get ready for Act 2. The lighting cues are all timed to your entrance." "Actually," I said, standing up and putting my arm around Ayana's shoulders, "she's not feeling well. Stomach bug, I think. We're going to head home." Mrs. Rodriguez's face fell. "Oh no. Tonight of all nights." "Well, don't worry. Jessica knows all the Fairy Queen's lines. We'll make it work." She looked at Ayana with genuine concern. "Feel better, sweetie. You were wonderful in Act 1. We gathered our things quickly, and I led Ayana toward the back exit, the one that opened onto the loading area behind the school. My heart was pounding, but we were almost free. Just 50 more feet to the door, then across the parking lot to my car, and we could be home with the doors locked before Marcus even realized we'd left the building. That's when I saw him. Marcus was standing at the far end of the hallway, positioned perfectly to block our path to the exit. He wasn't hiding anymore, wasn't lurking in shadows or pretending to be just another parent. He was standing in the middle of the corridor with his hands in his pockets, that familiar smile spreading across his face as he watched us approach. "Hello, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying easily in the empty hallway. "Ayana." I stopped walking immediately, my arm tightening protectively around my daughter's shoulders. Ayana pressed closer to me, and I could feel her trembling through the thin fabric of her costume. "You're violating the restraining order," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "You need to leave. Now." Marcus tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my words. "I'm not doing anything wrong. This is a public event, open to all members of the community. I have every right to be here." He took a step closer, and I instinctively backed up, keeping Ayana behind me. But there was nowhere to go. The hallway behind us led back to the crowded gymnasium, and Marcus was blocking the only exit. "I just want to talk," he continued, his tone reasonable and calm. "It's been 8 months, Sarah. Don't you think it's time we worked this out like adults? For Ayana's sake." His gaze kept shifting from me to my daughter, lingering on her face with that same possessive intensity I'd seen in the auditorium. It was like I wasn't even there, like I was just an obstacle preventing him from having a conversation with someone who belonged to him. "She's grown so much," he said, addressing Ayana directly now. "You look just like your daddy when he was your age. Same eyes, same stubborn chin. You remember your Uncle Marcus, don't you, sweetheart?" Ayana didn't answer, but I felt her grip tighten on the back of my jacket. She was scared, but she was also smart enough to stay quiet and let me handle the situation. "We're leaving," I said firmly, reaching into my purse for my phone. "And if you don't get out of our way, I'm calling the police." Marcus's smile never wavered. "Go ahead. Call them. Tell them a family member attended his niece's school play. Tell them I said hello and asked how she was doing. See how seriously they take that." He was right, and we both knew it. Standing in a school hallway, speaking in calm, reasonable tones, he didn't look like a threat to anyone who didn't know our history. He looked like a concerned uncle trying to reconnect with his estranged family. But I knew better. I could see the madness lurking behind his pleasant expression, the same dangerous delusion that had driven him to punch through my window 8 months ago. He truly believed that Ayana belonged to him, that some mystical family bond gave him rights that superseded court orders and common sense. And he wasn't planning to let us walk away. The standoff in the hallway stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Marcus continued to smile his unsettling smile while I calculated our options, all of which seemed to end with him getting closer to Ayana than I was willing to allow. My phone was in my hand, but he was right about one thing. Explaining this situation to a 911 operator would take precious time we didn't have. That's when I heard the sharp click of heels on linoleum behind us. "Sarah, is everything all right here?" I turned to see Mrs. Green approaching from the direction of the gymnasium, her PTA president badge still pinned to her navy blazer. Barbara Green had been a fixture at Roosevelt Middle School for over a decade, the kind of parent who organized fundraisers and volunteered for every committee. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd raised 4 children and wasn't easily rattled. More importantly, she knew our story. Mrs. Green had been present at the school board meeting where I'd requested additional security measures, where I'd explained about the restraining order and asked them to add Marcus's photo to their watch list. She'd been the one to suggest the buddy system for Ayana's walks to and from the bus stop. "Mrs. Green," I said, relief flooding through my voice. "This is Marcus Harrison. He's not supposed to be here." Mrs. Green's expression immediately shifted from mild concern to sharp attention. Her gaze moved from me to Ayana, then settled on Marcus, with the kind of steely assessment that came from years of dealing with difficult parents and problematic situations. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I'm going to need you to come with me to the main office." Marcus's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm here to watch my niece perform. Surely there's no school policy against family members attending public events." "Actually, there is," Mrs. Green replied calmly. "Specifically regarding you. We have your photograph in our security files, along with explicit instructions that you are not permitted on school property under any circumstances. The fact that you're here right now is not only a violation of your court-ordered restraining order, but also constitutes criminal trespass." I watched Marcus's face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He'd clearly expected to handle one frightened single mother and her child, not a well-informed school administrator who knew exactly who he was and why he wasn't supposed to be there. "Now I understand there might be some family complications," Mrs. Green continued, stepping slightly closer to us while maintaining a respectful distance from Marcus. "But this is neither the time nor the place to work those out. I'm going to ask you to leave the premises immediately, or I'll be forced to call security and the police." Behind Mrs. Green, I noticed 2 men in dark blue shirts approaching from the gym. The Riverside County School District had started hiring off-duty security guards for evening events after a series of incidents at other schools, and apparently Mrs. Green had already signaled for backup. Marcus saw them too. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might try to push past all of us to get to Ayana. But then his survival instincts kicked in, and I saw him mentally calculating the odds of success versus the likelihood of ending up in handcuffs again. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I have every right to see my brother's daughter. Courts make mistakes all the time. Orders get overturned." "Perhaps," Mrs. Green said diplomatically. "But until that happens, if it happens, you need to respect the legal boundaries that are currently in place. Officers Martinez and Thompson here will be happy to escort you to your vehicle." The 2 security guards had reached our little group, and I felt Ayana relax slightly against my side. Officer Martinez was an older Hispanic man with kind eyes and the build of someone who'd probably been a wrestler in high school. Officer Thompson looked younger, but carried himself with the quiet confidence of former military. "Sir," Officer Martinez said politely, "we're going to need you to come with us." Marcus looked around the circle of adults surrounding him, and I could see the exact moment when he realized he'd lost control of the situation. His carefully planned ambush had turned into a public confrontation with multiple witnesses, exactly the kind of scenario he'd been trying to avoid. "Fine," he said finally, his hands coming out of his pockets with deliberate slowness. "I'll leave. But this isn't over, Sarah. You can't hide behind other people forever. Family is family, and blood calls to blood." The words sent a chill down my spine, but Mrs. Green stepped forward before I could respond. "Mr. Harrison, I'm going to stop you right there. Any further communication with Miss Collins or her daughter constitutes harassment and will be reported to the authorities immediately. Officer Thompson, would you please make sure Mr. Harrison reaches his vehicle safely?" As the security guards flanked Marcus and began walking him toward the main exit, he looked back over his shoulder one last time. His eyes found Ayana's face, and his expression softened into something that might have been genuine sadness if it hadn't been so possessive. "You look so much like him," he called out. "Your daddy would be proud." Then they were around the corner and gone, leaving us standing in the suddenly quiet hallway. Ayana was still pressed against my side, and I could feel both of us shaking from the adrenaline. "Are you both all right?" Mrs. Green asked gently, her professional composure softening into maternal concern. I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. Through the open doors to the gymnasium, I could hear the sounds of the second act beginning, life returning to normal while our world had just shifted on its axis again. Officer Martinez radioed the police. Mrs. Green continued. "They'll want to get statements from both of you, and they'll probably want to file additional charges for the restraining order violation. But first, let's get you somewhere safe and quiet." For the first time in 8 months, I felt like we might actually be protected. Mrs. Green led us to the teacher's lounge, a quiet space away from the crowds where we could wait for the police to arrive. She brought us bottles of water and a box of tissues, though I didn't realize I was crying until Ayana gently wiped a tear from my cheek with her small hand. "It's okay, Mommy," she whispered. "He's gone now." But even as she comforted me, I could see the exhaustion in her 12-year-old eyes, the weight of having to be brave for far longer than any child should. She'd been living under this shadow for 8 months, always looking over her shoulder, always ready to run. Tonight was supposed to be her moment to shine, and instead it had become another chapter in our ongoing nightmare. Through the lounge windows, we could hear the muffled sounds of the second act continuing in the gymnasium. Jessica Martinez had stepped into the fairy queen role seamlessly, and the show was going on without us. Part of me felt guilty for leaving, for letting Ayana's big night be overshadowed by Marcus's obsession. But a larger part of me was simply grateful that we were safe. Officer Martinez returned 15 minutes later with news. "The police are here," he said. "They've got Mr. Harrison in custody in the parking lot. Detective Williams wants to speak with you both when you're ready." Detective Williams turned out to be a woman in her 40s with graying hair and the patient manner of someone who'd seen too many domestic situations go wrong. She sat across from us in the small lounge, her notebook open, and asked us to walk through everything that had happened from the moment I received Ayana's note. "He violated the restraining order just by being on school property," she explained as she wrote. "But his approaching you in the hallway, blocking your exit, and making those comments about blood calling to blood, that constitutes stalking and intimidation. We can hold him overnight and file additional charges." She turned to Ayana with a gentle smile. "You were very smart to pass that note to your mom. That quick thinking might have prevented something much worse from happening." Ayana nodded solemnly. "He's been watching me," she said quietly. "Not just tonight. I've seen his car parked across from school sometimes when I get on the bus. And last week at the grocery store with Mom, I thought I saw him by the pharmacy, but when I looked again, he was gone." My blood ran cold. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were already scared all the time," Ayana said, her voice small. "I didn't want to make it worse. But tonight when I saw him in the audience, I knew I had to tell you. He was staring at me like he thought I belonged to him." Detective Williams made careful notes of everything Ayanna said, treating her testimony with the same seriousness she'd given mine. Has he tried to contact you directly? Phone calls, texts, social media? No. Ayanna shook her head. Just the watching. But it made me feel creepy, like I was some kind of toy he wanted to take home. The detective's expression darkened. Well, he won't be watching you anymore. With these new charges, plus the restraining order violation, he's looking at serious jail time. And we'll be recommending that the court extend the protective order and add electronic monitoring when he's eventually released. As if summoned by our conversation, Mrs. Green appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to let you know that the show is almost over. Ayanna, if you want to take your bow with the rest of the cast, there's still time. I started to shake my head. We'd been through enough for one night, but Ayanna surprised me by sitting up straighter. Can I, Mom? Jessica did a great job, but I want people to know I was here too. I don't want him to take that away from me. Looking at my daughter's determined face, I saw something that took my breath away. She wasn't just my little girl anymore. She was a young woman who refused to let fear define her life, who wanted to reclaim her moment of triumph despite everything that had happened. Are you sure? I asked. I'm sure. I worked too hard on this to let him ruin it. And so, 20 minutes later, I found myself back in the gymnasium as the cast took their final bows. When Mrs. Rodriguez announced that Ayanna Collins, the original Fairy Queen, was in the audience and invited her to join the curtain call, the applause was thunderous. My daughter walked onto that stage with her head held high, still wearing her regular clothes but carrying herself like royalty. Through the lobby windows, I could see the police cars in the parking lot, their red and blue lights no longer a source of terror, but a symbol of justice finally being served. Marcus was in the back of one of those cars, handcuffed and defeated, his delusions of family ownership finally shattered against the reality of consequences. As Ayanna curtsied to her standing ovation, tears streamed down my face, not from fear this time, but from overwhelming pride. My daughter had found her voice tonight, both on stage and off. She'd faced down her stalker and chosen courage over hiding. The curtain fell on Marcus Harrison's reign of terror, but it rose on something new for us, the possibility of a future without fear, where a school play could just be a school play and a little girl could dream as big as she wanted without looking over her shoulder. For the first time in 8 months, we were truly free.